Welcome back to Dylan's World podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Enjoy the show. All right, Candace Lewis, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Indeed. So I usually like to start by having the guest give us a little bit of background on themselves. So I don't actually know your complete role, but I think you run the Bear Lab with ASU, the Brain Epigenetic Altered States Research Lab. Can
Correct.
you explain your role a little bit and just who you are?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Dr. Candace Lewis. I'm an assistant professor at ASU, and I run a research lab that I named the Bear Lab, which is the acronym for Brain, Epigenetics, and Altered States Research. My lab is interested primarily in how experiences alter DNA regulation, which is epigenetics, in gene systems involved in mental health. So like we're interested in experiences that happen early in life, like early life trauma, or even just lack of support, or other dimensions of childhood that aren't necessarily trauma that go on to influence mental health throughout our life. How those experiences can alter gene regulation, that ultimately, when you change gene expression, you change brain structure and function, which underlies all behavior. Additionally, we're not only interested in that like etiological pathway of like what drives us to maladaptive behavior, but also what types of therapies could be used to target those same pathways to undo or reverse or rewire the epigenome to lead to more adaptive behavior. And in that sense, I feel, and our lab feels, that psychedelic therapies really fit that bill for a lot of reasons.
Mm. It seems like when I'm researching you and listening to you on some other podcasts that you had a lot of interest, particularly in early life stress and that influence on our epigenetics.
Yes.
Is that what got you fascinated with early life stress in general, and the influence on our epigenetics? And then also, how does that change our gene expression?
What got me interested in early life stress? Well, there's like this saying in research that a lot of us are doing me search, which a lot of us, you can find a personal connection to why we study what we study. And I happen to be a child who was in and out of the foster care system and grew up with a lot of chaos and poverty. If you're familiar with the Adverse Child Experiences Questionnaire, the very famous ACE questionnaire, I have an ACE score of 7, which, according to research, is just like makes me extremely vulnerable to not only mental illnesses, but also a lot of different immunological and cardiovascular diseases as well. And while that research is getting more and more unpacked and people are becoming more familiar with it, it was always so obvious to me because I lived it. And I not only did I have those experiences, but growing up in rural Alaska, I also just witnessed a lot of how children's environments and experiences and home life really affected their well-being on every level. So when I was in graduate school, I was in an addiction lab that used animal models to study primarily the neurobiological effects of chronic exposure to drugs and how that changed neuronal function and systems level function to lead to then uncontrollable drug use. So as a graduate student, I was like, hey, like we also know the literature is very clear in the very strong relationship between early life stress and potential to develop addiction later in life. Can I do an early life stress model? And my PI was like, yeah, absolutely. Let's look at early life stress and how that affects methamphetamine self-administration. And I also learned the word epigenetics that year. So this was in 2010, where it was definitely already up on its upswing of research and the novelty and importance of it as a mechanism from environment to behavioral change. And at the time, the research field was really looking at how early life stress influenced epigenetics of stress physiology genes. So cortisol, we hear about cortisol a lot. I see it all over my social media news feeds. Cortisol is our slow acting stress hormone. And there's a whole system, very complex system that regulates its diurnal. So it's like daily actions. Every day our body goes through a cortisol slope. And then also our cortisol response to a stressor. And that's called the HPA axis. So during the time, a lot was coming out in both animals and human research showing that early life stress was changing the way that genes that regulate the HP axis express themselves. So basically, it was so groundbreaking because we have known for so long that our early life experiences can shape physiology and behavior and health for the long time, for the long term. But no one really
Mm.
understood the biological mechanisms. So at the time, I was like, well, why don't we start looking at addiction brain regions and addiction related gene systems instead of just stress physiology? So my early work was looking at how early life stress alters reward brain regions that are highly implicated in addiction epigenetically in a way that then shapes the animal's behavior towards taking drugs. So that's kind of
Mm.
where it all started, where it all came together.
Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating information, and obviously it's growing and developing, and we see the impact of addiction in our culture, especially with some of the crisis. And I'm local as well to Arizona, so I'm close by. But so as you know, there's the fentanyl issues and amphetamine abuse and things like that. So I grew up around a lot of people that I cared about, and heroin was a big thing in New Jersey where I grew up at like the time that I was in high school, and I would say shortly after. So I saw a lot of people struggle with addiction, and I felt, so I wanted to dive into that world. I'm not a scientist as yourself, but I was curious, and I was like, what? And then in conjunction with some of the issues that I had as well, and I, landed on the fact that obviously there's an early life stress and trauma connection. I'm sure there's environmental influence and all these other factors as well. Um, so I'm curious where the parallel came for you with the psychedelic research, and where did that start in conjunction
Mm-hmm.
with studying addiction
Mm-hmm.
and some of these genetic expressions and early life experiences.
Totally. So, as a graduate student, as a PhD student who was studying really the pathway towards how do individuals and why do some individuals seem more vulnerable towards going from recreational drug use or exposure to an addictive drug to that full-blown addiction pathway. While becoming an expert in that area, I was learning about a lot about neuropsychopharmacology, and in my reading and learning, it was really interesting to me to learn about the different profiles of different drugs, because I believe that in our society, we're not given a great drug education at all. And it's kind of just this general word is thrown out to the youth. Drugs are bad, don't do them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that can lead to a lot of issues and a lot of misuse if we're not being accurate and talking about that there's different types of drugs. And so when I read more about psychedelics, versus opiates, which is in your heroin
Mm-hmm.
category, and the OxyContin issue of the past, and then you have stimulants like cocaine, amphetamines, and methamphetamines, and alcohol is in its class, is considered a depressant.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the psychedelics, the more I read about them, like there was just like, it was kind of actually hard to find where the negatives were.
Mm-hmm.
So their toxicity, MDMA separate, MDMA does have a toxic profile and has dangerous doses. But for classic psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, you just could read and read about all the effects that it had, but you weren't finding these high toxicity levels. You weren't finding ODs, and you weren't even finding high addiction profiles. And what does that mean? So when you let animals have the choice to self-administer drugs, they will self-administer alcohol, they will self-administer opiates, they will self-administer amphetamines and other stimulants. But psychedelics, they'll take them and they won't progress to that uncontrollable daily chronic use.
Mm-hmm.
We also see the same thing in human populations. You can look at metabolites in the sewage system, because when we put things into our body, we excrete signs of what we've taken. And
Mm-hmm.
you can see that the more addictive compounds like alcohol, opiates, and stimulants, their levels kind of stay consistent throughout the week because addicts are using them daily and throughout the week. Where you look at the use of psychedelics and they spike on the weekends, which is kind of where they get the idea party drugs, right? Um, and then, so I was like learning just about the psychopharmacology across all drugs and realizing how different they are and how important it is, and that we all understand their differences in toxicity and addiction potential. The way that I like to describe it is kind of like, I feel like you can find any American on the street and they could tell you the difference between foods.
Hmm.
They could probably tell you the difference between vegetables, fruits, carbs. There's a general understanding that they're all food, but they're all very different in what they contain and what they're gonna and what your body is getting from them or not getting from them. And I really felt like that really was needed with drugs because yes, I'm here studying it's important to understand how people are more vulnerable or not to methamphetamine addiction. Uh, but there wasn't any research going on about why people vulnerable to psychedelic addiction because it wasn't really a thing.
Hmm.
Now, can people abuse psychedelics? Absolutely. Of course they can. People can abuse TV and sugar foods and sex.
Hmm.
Like, and I think there's just like a lot of confusion around and misuse of different words in this arena.
Hmm.
Second, I also found myself reading about the few clinical trials that had happened by that point, which was basically the trials looking at depression and anxiety symptoms in cancer patients. So these clinical trials that were very small came out of UCLA, Johns Hopkins, and New York University, showing that this controlled psychedelic experience with adequate preparation and safe substances and known doses in a safe setting with support, that people were really showing a profound response related to their mental health. So after a while, I'm like putting it all together.
Hmm.
I kind of realized that the things that people were experiencing while getting these psychedelic treatments, they just so directly addressed so many of the issues that people carry with them from early life trauma.
Hmm. You make a good point about people not having good drug education. And I think that's something that I take for granted due to intense personal research and then also personal experience and then witnessing the experience that sometimes people actually don't even understand the effects of different drugs. And I kind of forget that. So that is it's a good point that you make. So my curiosity is where down the line was this early in your academic career that you became interested in psychedelics, or did you have personal experiences prior to getting into the research? Was there again a personal experience that drove you towards interest in psychedelics, or was it more academically based where you started coming across research that made you interested? Does that question make sense?
Are you asking me if I've done psychedelics?
Well, I'm asking if you did psychedelics prior to becoming interested in them. Like, was this something that you took LSD, you took mushrooms, you took MDMA, and then you started realizing, or was this like, oh, the research indicates that these are safe. Let me see if this can benefit me.
Long after my interest started in this arena through academic pursuit, I did spend some time in Colombia where I was able to partake in a legal psychedelic ceremony.
Hmm. So in Colombia, what most of South America uses obviously different plants. Like? If may I ask if is it ayahuasca or is it psilocybin?
Hmm.
Um,
So, in the different countries in South America that partake in these traditional ceremonies, ayahuasca is a term used in a few of them, and in Colombia, it's actually yahe. But it
okay.
is still a similar plant brew in which DMT is mixed with an MAOI, so the monoamine oxidase inhibitor, so
Hmm.
that when drinking it, your DMT stays in your system longer, as opposed to if you ingest it through smoking and inhalation, it lasts not long at all.
Hmm. And so, in your this experience is prior to the Bear Lab and prior to getting into the research
No, it
department,
was
or
afterwards.
it's after? Okay, so I was just curious about that because I think a lot of people they have a psychedelic experience without the context, and then they get interested in the research afterwards. So the research pre was previous to your initial experience with this.
Yeah. Dylan, you've already asked me that a couple times. And I'm wondering if you understand that this is a sensitive topic for scientists to talk about.
Okay. Okay. Yeah,
You are talking about Schedule 1 substance use.
that's what I'm saying. Okay.
And as a scientist, it's not about what my personal experiences are.
Okay.
right?
Okay,
So like
cool.
I'm here to find the data and to lead to
Sure.
that.
Okay,
I've had
that's what.
extremely healing experiences through through that experience in Colombia. Um, but I think it's a really tricky field, right? Like this is one of the things that a lot of people are talking about and criticizing and asking psychedelic scientists about, wanting them to talk about their personal experiences.
Cool.
But I think the thing to realize is like, so if you know, if you're interviewing a vegan researcher about the effects of a vegan diet, like no one's asking them if they're vegan. It's kind of this weird area. It's such a different field for so many reasons, and this idea of, should psychedelic scientists have had experiences or should they not? Is it making them unbiased if they have? Is it making them biased if they have, or is it making it that they don't know what they're doing if they haven't?
Hmm.
Um, it's a really interesting dialogue that most scientists are not exposed to. So, like my
Sure.
wife does autism research. She's not asked if she's autistic.
No, and I understand that, and I actually can clip this if there's something like I don't want to put you in a compromised position.
Yeah, flip it however way you see fit. But I do think it is still an interesting thing to include in the interview because it's happening, right? It's like it's such a big part of what people are interested in hearing about. But at the end
Hmm.
of the day, I think everyone needs to kind of get back to the data,
Hmm.
and that scientists are looking for data, and that it's just really not about our personal experiences. And then we're also here in this world where we know that Maps was, you know, and the director of Maps was very much led by and very vocal of his personal experiences leading his passion.
Hmm.
And that ended up really biting them in the butt because it's not, there's no room to merge personal experience passion with
With the
trying to be
data.
an objective scientist. So, like,
Understood.
we're kind of seeing how that fell out in a really horrible way. So, I do think it's really important for scientists to try to stick to what they're doing scientifically and what does the data say scientifically instead of their personal experiences.
Okay. Understood. And yeah, there I understand where you're coming from. So my curiosity then is what is driving you to do this research then? What data are you looking towards? Like what area of human health, psychic health, cultural health are you looking to explore with the use of these psychedelics? And then which ones are you finding implications for improving people's lives or improving, and what aspects of their psyche do you feel that the research is being done to improve?
I think that a lot of people who are struggling with mental health issues, they have built very strong cognitive walls around those struggles and around that pain. Narratives that are hard to let go of, like I was unlovable, or I am not good enough, or or these things were my fault, or whatever it is that they're carrying. It's very, very hard to, one, acknowledge that what they're carrying is painful, acknowledge that what they're carrying might not be capital T truth, but just like a narrative that they're carrying that's causing them pain.
Hmm.
Separating out fact of what happened, of like, say, like, if what happened was an early sexual assault, that happened, and there's no negating what happened. However, there in the therapeutic pursuit, there's working on what your take home message of that, like what self belief did that event lead to, that's now leading to more of the mental health struggles.
Hmm.
What psychedelics are doing, MDMA and psilocybin, which is what there's the most clinical trials on looking at them, is they're letting people get into a state in the therapeutic process where they're more willing to, um, their belief systems become more malleable, more they allow themselves to see that the belief systems are not the fact, and that we're not that no one's negating the fact that things happened, that trauma happened, that bad things happened, that they have been in pain and that it really affected them. Those can remain facts while they can rework on and reassess their feelings of self-worth. And so not only are these compounds helping them like break down like increasing their cognitive flexibility, breaking down their cognitive rigidness, it's happening during a time where they also are feeling higher levels of insight and connection. So it's like it's a fantastic therapeutic experience with all of those pieces coming together. And that's at the subjective psychological level. Molecularly or cellularly, we're also seeing evidence that they're increasing neuroplasticity, which I laugh because that word's just been used so heavily now in this field. And really, if we look back at the roots, like, what do we mean? What do people mean neuroplasticity? Okay, because neuroplasticity is how the brain works. There is, we are plastic individuals. That's how we're able to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So neuroplasticity is the cellular foundation of learning and memory. So if you
Mm-hmm.
and I went and learned a dance together, if I like, hey, let's learn this dance, and we like practice it and practice it and practice it, and then next week we still remembered it, that's neuroplasticity. Your neurons structurally changed to code new motor memories to learn that dance.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, psychedelics increase neuroplasticity. So do drugs of abuse, which is why they're able to alter our behavior also.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of things. Exercise is a really profound inducer of neuroplasticity too. So then why does it matter? Like, why is it a great thing? So while we're having this really intense therapeutic experience where our cognitive rigidity is in decrease, so we're able to actually address these like cognitive stories that we've been holding on to so tightly our whole life. Also, we're feeling connectedness, bliss, insightfulness. Um, and it's all happening during a time where perhaps we have this like increased ability for at the cellular level for these experiences to leave a lasting impression on us. What's important with that though is this is not a take a psychedelic and be healed forever because
Mm-hmm.
you felt loved while you were tripping and your cells were able to learn easier.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a magic hour of or 6 hours. It's not a magic day. You have to still implement the lessons learned afterwards, which is the same as therapy without psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
Like effective therapy is not happening just in your hour session a week. It's about what insights are you having in the therapeutic room and how are you applying them to your life. And psychedelic therapy does not skip that step. Whatever insights you have or new feelings of worth or ability to break away from these strong narratives, you still have to practice that in life when you're not on the substance. The substance is there to help people get there.
Mm-hmm. And with the Bear Lab, are you guys, and let me know if these are questions that you're not really releasing to the public. Are you researching some of these compounds? Are you in conjunction with other research areas? Are you working individually with people who are having these experiences and then documenting from that place?
So in my lab, we're really interested in the genomic regulators of that long-term behavioral change. So everything that we just talked about, right? So I talked about how my lab is interested in how experiences changes through epigenetics.
Mm-hmm.
So I just described in length what that psychedelic therapeutic experience is like. So
Correct.
we're interested in seeing, was that experience, mm, was it so salient, or did it do what it needed to do to leave an effect on your epigenome?
Mm-hmm.
And is that effect on the epigenome what's leading to changed behavior?
Mm-hmm.
So, like an example, I like to call it like the inverse of trauma. So, I think we all kind of have this understanding that there can be an individual who is not suffering from psychiatric symptoms, and then in a day, they get mugged at gunpoint or sexually assaulted or are in a horrific car wreck, right? In a day, we can go through something so horrible and salient that we then develop psychiatric symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance abuse. We all get that things happen to us that then the behaviors emerge, the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
So our question is kind of, is the psychedelic therapy experience, sorry, let me backtrack. So when the bad, all the horrific things that happen, there's like a huge body of evidence showing that these horrific events change the epigenetics and that we can see the epigenetic change, the signal underlying symptoms. So this is like the psychedelic experience is like the inverse. It's the inverse of trauma. Is that experience so salient that we can look at the epigenetic change that leads to the symptom reduction?
Mm-hmm.
So
And you,
the way that we're doing that is like we're not running clinical trials ourselves. We're partnering with other institutions and clinics to collect samples from their patients and participants.
mm. You touched on something before where you were saying the part of the universal psychedelic experience can be feelings of oneness, connectedness. Um, so I would describe that more as like an awe-inspired feeling, which is great, and it also is a healing experience. That being said, there's so a lot of because you're in this world, I actually wanted to talk to you about this. There's an author or a writer, and he puts stuff online, and he writes. His name's Brian James, but he writes about traumadelic culture. So it's partially a criticism, but it's just an observation about how psychedelic research has become centered pretty heavily around trauma. But the early psychedelic renaissance in the 60s and then some of the reemergence beyond then was also related to those the feelings of like an anti-institutional feeling, awe inspiration, getting out of yourself, being in touch with the wonder of childhood, which again is a healing experience, and they kind of correlate. Are you interested in exploring that domain with your lab? Same as I feel like the natives and the people in Colombia and Peru, and there's another element to it that actually doesn't just relate to trauma healing. So I'm guessing my question is, do you feel like there could over time be sort of an excessive medical focus on trauma, and then that's bleeding into the psychedelic realm, which can.
Yeah. Okay. I hear you. So there's so much to unpack here, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. So I
Okay.
think there's like two things.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, psychedelic experiences don't have to be about trauma healing per se. And the traditional native cultures did it so much, it seemed like there was like so much more of an element of wellness and spirituality and community. And it didn't have to be about a disorder and a trauma. Um, that universal and community experience that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And does the current pathway that we're all on, like leading to FDA regulation and allowing it to become part of the medical model, ignore all of that? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Am I sad about that? Yes.
Okay.
Are we stuck in the current um, structures that we have? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So now we can talk about what are the current structures. I think that mental health generally is over clinicalized.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much data showing that depression and anxiety, PTSD, and substance abuse disorders, like they're all just related to, like they're so heavily overlapping one in comorbidity. So their symptom clusters are highly related to each other. And now the molecular genetic evidence is showing us that genetic risk factors are highly similar across all these disorders. It's so hard. So I also have I'm also a
It's
licensed
10:30.
counselor, and have done, eons of work in my own healing for my own life trauma. And I think that healing, it's so much more than ever could be put into a science. It's so much bigger. However, we are in this world now, right? Where like to go get therapy, you have to have a diagnosis for your insurance to cover it.
Mm-hmm.
To get the FDA to agree to not make these Schedule One substances, this is the only model that they communicate in. I don't see a path to go to our regulatory bodies and be like, hey, people want these substances just to tap in with wellness in their
Mm-hmm.
community and to be happy. I would love it if we could be on that path somehow, but
Mm-hmm.
we are so not. And now with the new administration, who knows what path we're on?
Mm-hmm.
No one really knows. But I think that there's just so many levels of complexity to this, and it all really like starts back to the war on drugs. Which like we're over, I think, 70 years into the war on drugs, and in not quite 70, but figuring out like there's so much misinformation, like we've already talked about. People don't even really understand the difference between methamphetamine, heroin, and psilocybin. The
Mm-hmm.
average person on the street does not get the difference. To them, drugs are bad. To them, they have a neighbor or a cousin or an aunt who died of addiction, and drugs are bad.
Mm-hmm.
Undoing that at the societal level is going to take data. Descheduling at the governmental level is going to take data.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of standards and necessities of collecting data, of running studies in a scientific way, that you have to meet for that data to be recognized by experts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why there's so much like misalignment between between kind of what you're getting at is like I think the question is, should Americans have the right to experience this without a diagnosis?
Mm-hmm.
What I think that answer is doesn't really matter. It's like I think we all have to navigate the current restrictions that we have.
Mm-hmm. Understood. I mean,
And
I think,
and
yeah.
there's the risks, and I hear people talk about this a lot, and I think that there's a lot to be said about there's so much on both sides. These are powerful substances, really
Mm-hmm.
powerful, and people can have really scary, hard experiences, especially when done too young, without the right supports, without the right knowing anything about doses or what's about to happen to you. Um, so I get that because those are facts, there are a lot of people who very much want to keep them illegal, right? Like keep them out of the hands of children. I find that to be a little bit hypocritical, even though the facts are facts and I agree with them. However, prohibition does not keep drugs out of people's hands.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to, as a society, find a way of all acknowledging the harmful impacts of unsafe drug use, and that includes alcohol. Finding a way of acknowledging that, keeping safeguards for youth, keeping safeguards and better education for everyone, and something other than prohibition.
Some education would be helpful, but there's so much cultural influence, particularly with alcohol. It's obviously the accepted drug of our time, of
It
all
is.
time. But yeah, and so I mean, I agree. I think that whether I like it or not, it seems that that model is we're in the medical model. So having good people behind it, such as yourself, that actually care is important as well. So you're obviously pulling data and working with individuals, and you're doing this from a good place. I mean, of course, psychedelics as well have their risks, and they've been used as manipulative tools by intelligence agencies, and um, they're they can put you in they put you in a hypnotic state, so they can be used as negative tools, which is the reason I brought that up is just because that does become a concern for me as we navigate this model, that you don't know who's always serving this or who's behind the scenes. Sort of irrelevant. Again, you seem to be in a good place, coming from a place of honesty and integrity, which is the most important thing. So I wanted to ask, because it seems I want to get some specificity for certain people who may not be familiar. So I think a lot of the post-traumatic research is has there's good implications with MDMA,
Mm-hmm.
and if you can explain why, I've heard people explain why, but I'd like for others to understand, and also for myself to understand more deeply, why MDMA specifically is beneficial for post-traumatic stress.
Well, so what I want to talk about, one, there's the limitations of what has been done, right? So MDMA has been done with PTSD in multiple clinical trials, 2 phase 3 trials that were completed. So we can talk about why it works specifically because we have that data. But as far as I know, we don't have it. We don't have psilocybin PTSD trials.
Hmm.
So there's really actually no comparison to say MDMA works for PTSD and psilocybin doesn't.
Hmm.
It's just what has been done. So we can say what did work.
Hmm.
I do think that MDMA has more so than psilocybin, it provides a sense of safety. So,
Hmm.
because of MDMA's pharmacological profile, you're getting a huge increase in not just serotonin, but also oxytocin. I almost said OxyContin. I'm always,
That'd be interesting.
yeah. So oxytocin is, it's called the love drug and the love hormone and the hug hormone and all these fun things. And it's released by engaged parents and babies and with lovers and all of these times where really we naturally evolved to need these moments of feeling secure, ultimate connection. MDMA helps us feel that. And in that state, it's becomes possible to really go there and to acknowledge our pain and our fear and our hurt, that, like I was talking about before, a lot of times people can't do in a normal unaltered state because of years of not doing it.
Hmm.
It helps people to get there. So now, psilocybin doesn't have that same increase in oxytocin. I think that in that state, people are experiencing a lot more insight and a lot more cognitive flexibility, which could be beneficial for a lot of people with a lot of different disorders and non-disorders, as you pointed out. However, for PTSD particularly, because in this population, it's part of the diagnostic criteria that whatever, like that the experience, the trauma is part of why you have this diagnosis, then it's just so much more of a cleaner clinical population to be like, let's, you have this thing that happened, let's try MDMA therapy so that you can get to that state of safety to process it and heal from it. However, I I think that anyone suffering with severe, I shouldn't say anyone, generally, anyone suffering from severe mental health issues, they also have trauma to talk about. It's just not part of their diagnostic criteria.
Hmm. I mean, yeah, I think trauma is a deep part of almost all human experience and human history, for that matter. And so, and I will actually eventually I want to circle back to that Traumadelic article, but I don't want to go there right this moment. But the what sort of people and mental and cognitive structures and humans generally would something like psilocybin be applied for, and what sort of issues would psychedelics generally, but psilocybin included, not be implied for and maybe actually be not helpful for? Are there conditions you would say that might be very risky to start?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
So evidence from the first era of psychedelic science was already that like if individuals had any kind of psychosis history or a close family member with psychosis history, that they were more at risk for psilocybin or LSD to shoot them into a psychotic episode.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because of those early findings, modern clinical trials don't allow participants that fit that criteria. So
Mm-hmm.
if you've had a psychotic episode, if you have a close family member who's had a psychotic episode, you're not allowed to be in the clinical trials. So that really is leaving us a bit with not any data to kind of like back up, like how can we determine who is and isn't at risk, especially for people who are adopted and don't have a family history.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of something the Bear Lab's really interested in doing, is seeing if we can generate genomic predictors for who has negative responses, or who has these responses that are actually making their mental health worse. Because I do want to be clear, I get that so often we talk about like the insight and the bliss and the feelings of unity as being the therapeutic experiences, but it's more than that. Sometimes the psychedelics lead us to an experience in therapy that are not rainbows and bunnies, and it's hard. And
Mm-hmm.
people can be on the floor crying and writhing in pain. It's so hard. And that happens in real therapy, that happens in non-assisted therapy too. Like therapy is hard, like processing and going there and um, doing therapy can be really difficult. And I don't like to give the impression that psychedelics are going to ensure that you have like a nice, like cuddly, huggy experience of processing.
Yeah.
No, like that's healing can be really painful. Um, so okay, so back where we were. So I think that there are people who biologically are going to be more at risk to having a long-term negative consequence of this, and that needs to be figured out. Like science, like studies need to be addressing that, not just excluding them from clinical trials. That's hard to do, obviously. And then so that's kind of an element of, like, yes, I do think there are people who are more biologically at risk. Two, I had someone many years ago when giving a talk, they're like, well, how do we know that this isn't just selection bias, that everyone who believes psychedelics are going to work, they're the only ones volunteering for trials. So of course it worked for them because they already believed in it. And I was like, what an interesting point.
Mm-hmm.
That is true of every single study.
Mm-hmm.
Every single study by law. We don't force people into studies. They have to volunteer.
Hmm.
So all clinical trials that have an intervention, these people volunteered to receive that intervention. In the same vein, once these are used in medical practice, we will not force treatment on anyone. There's no one that a doctor's going to say, like, you are doing a psilocybin session today. And everyone's in there, no, I don't want to. Because that would be a person who's not ready to do it.
Hmm.
Do you hear what I'm saying? If
I
someone's
do.
like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to face my demons, I don't want to lose cognitive control, I don't want to writhe in pain because I'm letting like years of pain that I've shoved down come through me. I don't want to do that. Great, they shouldn't.
Correct. Yeah, it could. Well, of course, if you're not, it could be borderline emotionally unsafe and psychologically very difficult.
Yeah.
So,
And again, like that is true for all modes of therapy. It is unethical for any therapist to push either a technique or a narrative or going somewhere on their patient that the patient doesn't feel prepared and ready to go to. That's just not ethical. That's not how treatment works. No one's going to be forcing people to do psilocybin therapy. Now, being scared a little bit, like being like nervous, that's fine.
mhm.
Most people are nervous the first time they go to therapy. And yeah, it's going to be fine to feel a little bit nervous to go into this world of an altered state of healing. That's okay. But there needs to be a strong conviction in every patient that they're ready and that they're doing this willingly.
Yes, I mean, psychedelics are a little bit scary by nature because it does imply lack of control, surrender, and if you're unwilling to go there, it's going to be very difficult and you might cause yourself some harm. One question about the genes, and you might have answered this early on. What areas of the brain or genetic factors are consistently improved by specific psychedelic experiences? Are there just across the board certain benefits that you see when people have a good experience that are really implied heavily in favor of some of these compounds?
There's not enough research out there to answer that question. So
Okay.
there are very, very few epigenetic papers. One of them being from my lab and many collaborators looking at the MAPS phase 3 clinical trials, where we look at epigenetic change in those HPA genes that I talked about earlier. Um, and there's some other papers that came from an ayahuasca retreat. So they looked at epigenetic change also, but it wasn't like a clinical trial with a control group. So it still shows this association between the experience and epigenetic change. But that's out there in humans. So at the epigenetic level, we are still just like running blind, and which is why my lab is committed to and believes that that is a really important area that we need to go to. Um, there's much more in neuroimaging and they show changes in resting state functional connectivity, which is this like big fancy term to show what is it that your brain is doing while at rests, right? Like not task based, not task focused, and they show changes. Um, but at the genomic level, there's not a lot. And then mostly what's out there, which I think is like this is what matters, right? Is symptom improvement. Because whether we show changes in brain or epigenetics, that's all understanding mechanism. That's all understanding the biology underneath the change in behaviors. But at the end of the day, if we didn't have data showing us improved clinical presentation, decreased symptoms, nobody would care. Then shouldn't be looking at the brain or the epigenome. It's really showing this change in behaviors, and like you were said before, it's not just clinically. Like we're not just looking at changes in symptoms. I love the literature that's looking at changes in personality structures and openness and neuroticism in healthy populations. I love that stuff. I think it's also really important. Again, it's not ever going to be the type of data that we convince the government to change scheduling on. Look, people become more open. Let's let them use it. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. But what I love about it is because so many people, and I don't know if they're still teaching this, but for a long time in psychology, we're all taught personality structure is not very malleable. It develops early in life and you tend to keep it the rest of your life.
Mm.
And I think that after the life I've lived, which has been full of adventure and pushing myself to the limits in many different ways, not just psychedelics, that and then the psychedelic field that shows people who've had these experiences tend to decrease in neuroticism and increase in openness. I'm like, okay, so maybe all the data before that showed that personality was not malleable and set early in life, those people just weren't growing. Those
Mm.
people weren't getting challenged. Those people maybe lived a life and in a society that celebrated and enforced comfort over growth.
Hmm.
And I love that idea, right? In a very like in a theoretical way, and understanding human and understanding culture and humans and behavior and what our capacity is. I love the idea that finding things that challenge us to grow and that help us grow. Maybe it's skydiving or snowboarding or, intense exercises. I don't know. There's a lot of different paths. Long distance running, um, dancing for 3 nights straight, fasting, right? These are all things that like ancient societies did in their own way.
Hmm.
Pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zones probably does help us change our personality. I hope to God people's personalities are not developing at 18 and staying that way till they die. Like, come on.
Yeah, be pretty awful.
But back to where we're at, right? Like that's never
Mhm.
going to change regulation.
Mm, Well, what's cool about you in this discussion is that obviously you're in the world of science and you're in the academic realm, but you have this interest in ancient cultures and you have the interest in understanding that these intense experiences, whether they be psychedelic or skydiving or snowboarding or just something that shapes us in a way that we can't measure. And and that's what was important. And I was curious to talk to you about it because someone like Wim Hof, if you're familiar, do you know the Iceman, like the dude he has broken several world records for how long he could stay in ice, and he's kind of one of the early people who brought that cyclic hyperventilation style of breath work. Now it's been restructured and repackaged by many different people, which is good. It's not they might have actually improved it, but he was one of the first that was like, I can control my body with intense breath. You get into an altered state, and also I can get into freezing cold water because I'm controlling my immune system. Really
So
cool guy.
you
You should
you
definitely.
take like Stanley Groff's breath work paradigms and take it into cold plunging.
So similar, because yeah, Stan Groff obviously was the OG of the holotropic, one of the OGs in the holotropic breathwork
Mhm.
realm. But I would say Wim Hof. I don't know what his initial thing was because he's been doing this for a long time. So he's not a newbie. I think he's in his 60s, and he kind of begun this when he was like 17, where he went into a freezing cold lake and was like, I can control this with I can control my immune system with my breath. So I'm sure he had heard of it before. That was where the connection was made. But he's a really interesting cat. I would definitely definitely check him out. But my experience with Wim Hof breathwork or holotropic breathwork is that gets you in an altered state of consciousness. Have you had experience with like Stan Groff's type of breathwork or not?
I've done some slight breath work stuff. It does not take me to an altered place. In the same way, though, I also feel like so in the therapeutic world, right? EMDR is pretty popular for trauma processing. A lot of people have great experiences with it. Like it is growing popularity. A lot of therapists are using it, and it doesn't do a thing for me.
Mm,
So that's why I think that it is so important to like kind of look at these like what's going to work for different people.
address the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so the reason I had my uh, friend had interviewed or did a podcast with Brian James, and then I read the Traumadelic culture stuff, which I do recommend looking into because it's just really fascinating, and I do get concerned, and I'm sure you have some of the same concerns, even being part of that world, that this is all centered around the medical model. And yes, it's probably going to be the way that culture accepts it, but it might come with its own implications because most of the younger people that are familiar with psychedelics now, which is a good thing that they're familiarizing themselves, but a lot of it's packaged around childhood trauma. And that is a good thing, and it has negative implications in the sense that you're going in with that intention. You're approaching this altered state from a place of self-healing, maybe not always a sense of what can I experience, how can I expand, how can I grow. Obviously they correlate, but I just had, because initially I was illuminated by Dr. Gabor Mate's work when I first got introduced to it, because I hadn't had this discussion around trauma so much, and then the psychedelic connection to trauma, and it made me realize a lot about the world that we live in and a lot about addicts and a lot about myself. That being said, over time, I also realized that there's becoming a fixation on early childhood experience and trauma, and it might be holding people back. And I'm sorry, I know this isn't related to genetics so much, but
No, it's okay.
yeah, but
Keep
it's
going.
just that I am, but that's I was, again, you're in this world, and that's where a lot of the research is coming from. But
Can
I'm
you tell me what
wondering,
you mean by holding people back? Do you
I
think it's
think,
if people don't feel like they have childhood trauma, then they won't do this?
no, well, partially, but not necessarily. I think maybe meaning a fixation on the past and an inability to move forward.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
of
mm-hmm,
course, that's what psychedelics seem to help with, but it's a constant revisiting of childhood trauma, and not to take away anything from childhood trauma, because that shapes the entirety of someone's life. But people are also starting to label. I believe, I could be incorrect, but I think people are labeling negative experiences as traumatic, and they have traumatic implications. But to fixate on the idea that a bad experience was trauma to your nervous system might actually convince you that you are traumatized.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you that any kind of fixation or convincing people that there's something wrong with them because of an experience they had is definitely not the route we want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think really what I hear you describing more so than anything that's happening clinically or scientifically is what's happening through blog posts and podcasts
Mm-hmm.
and social media. I think there's so much more content around this stuff that is not coming from clinicians
Mm-hmm.
or researchers. And this hyper focus on, as you're describing it, like this kind of like what happened to you was trauma and you are messed up and your central nervous system is messed up and you are dysregulated. This is pop neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
That's not real. This is what's happening on the youth social media feeds. I see it all the time. Your, dopamine addictions and your cortisol and the younger generation are reading all of this and it's really hard to differentiate what's real or not. So I don't think there's like therapists or scientists or articles that are like trying to convince people you're messed up whether you think so or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're trying like what this field is doing is we're doing actual real exploration into people who do have PTSD and they
Mm-hmm.
do have severe depression and they do have these very high clinical profiles of struggling of like behaviors that those are we all agree need treatment. And
Mm-hmm.
the psychedelic world is like, what can treatment look like? How can we improve it? And my world is like, what are the biological mechanisms of what led to those symptoms, and what are the biological mechanisms of treatment that can address that? Now, I think what you're referring to is really happening and it is a huge problem. And I don't really know, like I don't really have an answer for you to how to solve it. But to
Mm-hmm.
me, what you're describing is like what's happening on social media.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, which is influencing culture. I
It
do
is.
think
It
that
is. Yeah.
there's some clinic, like, again, like a Gabor Mate, who I have a lot of respect for. He's
I
brilliant.
love his work. I've met him
Yeah.
before. He's great.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And so I guess it's more, it's how does it influence people, and then how does that influence the culture, like you said, who are not clinically involved in
Yeah.
this. But
Yeah.
yeah, because I don't want to when I say this, it's touchy, because I don't want to take away anything from the fact that there's a lot of people who are like really struggling, like with
Yeah.
really deep stuff. And so I'm definitely not insensitive to that. I know many humans that I love that have like deep
Yeah.
suffering.
I don't hear that you're being insensitive.
Okay.
I do think that though, so like nobody wants anyone to be convinced of something that's not real.
Mm-hmm.
And like, like your central nervous system is dysregulated, and even if they're like, oh, it is, I feel fine. No one's trying to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of hyper focusing on and regurgitating and getting stuck in this trauma narrative instead of moving on, that is what non-healing looks like. When
Mm-hmm.
we talk about healing and we talk about moving on, the first step is validation. And if someone needs to be validated either by themselves or from a therapist or from their loved ones or from the community of like, hey, what happened to you was hurtful, it was harmful, I validate you. That's not the end of therapy. That's
Mm-hmm.
the first step. therapists, like in this world, that's that is that's known. The goal is not to have patients ruminating over their trauma.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that addressing it, validating it, accepting it is the path to healing, not anyone getting stuck on it.
Mm-hmm. And in that realm, with people that are experiencing deep trauma or they're heavily addicted, is a lot of the data indicating serious benefit for these people who, especially with addiction signs? Because again, you see so many people struggling with serious drug addiction. Do you feel, and does the data indicate that people struggling with real deep addictions are having a lot of benefit from certain substances and experiences?
New York University has published 2 phase 2 trials looking at psilocybin assisted therapy for those struggling with alcohol use disorder, and they are really having great effects. There's, I believe, multiple ongoing trials right now that are doing psilocybin in conjunction with opiate replacement therapies to see if that can help improve their outcomes. So again, very like there's not that much out there, but what we have out there so far is showing improvements. And I think it's like it's all related to what you're saying, right? So like if someone is stuck in this loop of being hyper focused on what happened to them in the past, what does that actually look like? It looks like depression, anxiety, and substance abuse.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that manifests as. Successful treatment is the moving on, and in doing so, moving on, right? Like it's healing. You know, ever like I think moving on is a weird cheap stab at what healing can look like, but the reduction of symptoms, the ability to lead a healthy, happy, high well-being life, that is the act of non-rumination.
Mm-hmm. And what my a question to you is are you what are you witnessing with our culture? This is kind of a personal observational question, but what are you, and also in terms of like what you're doing with the research, what patterns are getting worse and what things do you think are getting better? But what are you seeing in our culture and a lot of the people who are reaching out for this information? Like a lot of depression, a lot of addiction. Are you seeing, do you feel like the issues are increasing?
I mean, the data is clear. Rates of diagnoses are increasing for sure
Mm-hmm.
across the board. Depression, substance abuse, psychiatric disorders are on the rise.
It's 11 o'clock.
Now, what I see changing though is that people are opening up and being curious. I think there's way less, actually data shows it's not, I don't think. Your generation is way less, there's way less stigma about going to therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And many more people are going to therapy. And I think that's all a wonderful thing. I do think that the word trauma is getting kind of this like, it's getting hijacked by popularity. So I think that with every step in progress in any system that you look at, there's a step in progress and you can always find the unintended consequences. For example, social media, we are seeing a world in which more people have had voices than ever before. Women are being heard, people of color are being heard, in a way like we have so many more voices. It's so wonderful and beautiful, and we've seen so much change come from that. Also, it is a hyper speed fast highway of misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
So for every step forward, there's going to be unintended consequences. So I love that we're talking more about early life trauma. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. I think it's wonderful. I think so many people need it. I think that semantics can get messy, and it doesn't have to be called trauma. It could be early life stress. It could be called early life day that sucked. I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a person who is struggling with any form of self-worth, and it can be unpacked as like, I really felt like my parents were only proud of me if I got straight A's.
Mm-hmm.
Is that trauma? No. Are you a perfectionist workaholic at work because of it? Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
How it's like it doesn't have to be clinical, it doesn't have to be trauma. But I do agree that I think that it could be getting hijacked, and definitely a lot of misinformation out there.
Mm. No, and I agree. I think that the more we can grow to understand who we are and how our patterns shape us will improve
Yeah. Yeah.
way that we interact with the world in each
And
relationship. So
it's interesting because we both are such fans of Gabor Mate in Mate, and this is his whole thing. Like this is his whole thing. That like our early childhood experiences is so much what shapes us.
yeah, yeah. The reason I brought him up was because again, with this Brian James guy, I had personal experiences with him, and I do see I have because I like him. I actually have that's why I have some thoughts around it. Like I would actually push back on some of the ideas over time, but initially I have a lot of respect for what he does.
Okay,
But
so Saban, funny story. He actually, I think we were on the phone or something. He called me one time. He wanted to interview me for one of his books. I don't know which one. Someone
mm,
messaged me one time. I was like, I just read you just read you in a Gamer Mate book. I'm like, really? Did I sound good? Yeah. Anyways, and I kind of pushed back on him too because what he wanted to talk about is he wanted to talk about that he kind of wanted to assess his statement by me that genetics play no role. And I
mm,
was like, nah, I can't agree with that. There's a role of genetics. Like we
mm-hmm,
have genes, we inherit them. They absolutely play a role in our physiology and some behavior constructs. To say there's no role in the development of depression or anxiety or substance disorders, I cannot agree with that. However, do I think that role has been completely overblown? And do I think that people thinking everything is genetic is allowing us to ignore how sick our society is environmentally? Yes. So like I push back a little bit too. It's like, no, we have to talk about genetics. Like they're real, they're a thing, they matter. But I think that our early life experiences, our environment, our culture, our how we relate to each other, if we have community or not, how much emotional availability our parents are able to provide us, I think are just so much bigger part of the overall makeup of who we end up becoming.
mm,
I happen to want to study that at the molecular level.
mm. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you talking to me. If is there anything that you would want to share before we wrap it up with people regarding this research or how to approach it, and anything you'd want to share? That's a broad question.
I think that I think that we touched on some really interesting things, and I really appreciate you for going there in a lot of ways. Like, I do think that there's a whole systems and like global thing happening with people in their, we'll call it their 20s, and how much information they're getting exposed to and what are they getting exposed to. And we're going to see more and more people taking these substances on their own.
Mm,
And like you said, maybe like with the idea of wanting to focus on their darkest, deepest secret experiences. And I think that that's really scary. I think
mm,
that, I think that I hope that everyone stays safe and learns about these things with interest, and if they need to, finding a safe way of going about experiences with trusted professionals. I mean, I within my circles, I know have multiple early adult or teenage suicides from trying to go about this by themselves. So on one hand, there is, like you talked about with the ancient practices, there's these experience these are doing these experiences for spiritual growth. They were always done in community, right? And so like right now with social media and with how alone people are most of the time, and they're reading about their about their nervous system being dysregulated, and these are powerful experiences that you need support in navigating, because like we've talked about before, whether you go in there with the intent or not, like, okay, I'm going to go in here to like meet my ancestors and grow, you might have stuff come up that's really really hard.
mm-hmm,
And so I really do want to put out there like the importance of doing it safely and having secure community support. And that's not just for during the time. It's for afterwards. Like a lot of times what comes up for people is so hard for them, they have nowhere to turn to. So I don't know. I guess I would end it. It's messy. This
yeah.
is thousands of years. This is colonization. This is current FDA. This is current mental health. I mean, this stuff is messy. And I think that part of the problem is a lot of times these social media outlets of education simplify things. They oversimplify things.
Yes, I agree. Go cautiously and do some research and hopefully have some way of integrating the experience. And a lot of us are reckless when
Yeah.
we're young. My first I haven't had tons of experiences, but my first one was totally non-contextual and it could have been harmful. I was like, Jesus Christ, this is a crazy dimension and I
Yeah.
don't know how to explore it. So
And
Um,
do research is a funny thing. I hear the youth say a lot. And by the way, when they say do research, and I ask them to tell me what research they've been doing, the answer I get the most is watching YouTube videos.
fair.
This is a major this is the thing that's happening. And yeah, I don't really know what to say about it. Anyone who comes into my lab quickly learns that that's not research.
Hmm. Well,
Um, yeah, thank you for
thank you so
having
much
me.
for what you do, Candace. I appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Remember to like the show, follow, subscribe. I'm available on YouTube and Spotify. Thank you.